them questions, as well as ask historical, cultural questions with our music historian. So that'll be really fun. So we have lots of fun things coming up. With that, I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker. Frank de la Teja is Regents Professor Emeritus, a University Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History at Texas State University. He received his PhD in Latin American History from UT Austin. He's also worked in the Archives and Records Division of the Texas General Land Office, which I know we utilize a lot here at the museum, and many Texas museums do. From 2018 to 2020, he served as CEO of the Texas State Historical Association. He has published extensively on Spanish, Mexican, and Republic-era Texas, including award-winning Recollections of Tejano Life, Antonio, and I'm probably going to say it wrong, Menchaca, there it is, in Texas history, and that's only to name one. He has several publications. He has served as president of the Texas State Historical Association, on the content development team for the Bob Bullock Museum. He's also served as an expert reviewer for the TEAC Social Studies Standards for the State Board of Education. He's also been an inaugural state historian for Texas. He's an honorary admiral in the Texas Navy and an honorary member of the Sons of the Republic of Texas. So in 2017, the San Jacinto Battleground Conservancy named him a hero of San Jacinto. So we are very fortunate to have such a prestigious speaker with us today. I'm sure he can answer any of your questions about early Texas history. So let's give him, well, we can't give you an applause, but I will. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you. Oh, let me explain one thing before I do. We will be taking questions. You should see a question box to the right-hand side of your screen, a Q&A. Just type your questions in there, and at the end of his presentation, I will unmute you and you can ask your question. If you don't have a microphone, that's okay. I can ask it for you. Just type your question in there or just say me, and I'll unmute you so you can ask your question. All right, with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you for being here this evening. I can't see all of you, but I can tell you that I've done this often enough to know that some of you are very shy, but don't be shy. If you have any questions, I'm going to hold them off until the end, but you can start plugging them in to the Q&A, and we'll take it from there. And what I want to do is, you probably get really bored of looking at me after a couple of minutes. I certainly get bored of looking at myself. So what I want to do is go ahead and start the PowerPoint presentation, and I'll give my talk over the PowerPoint. And if any of you see an image that is of particular interest to me, you can also include that in Q&A, and we can talk about that later as well. So let's go ahead and get started here. Let's see if I can minimize a couple of these things. Great. And I'm going to reduce myself because you really don't need to see me, and I hope you don't right now. So thank you for your invitation to address the topic of Tejanos and the coming of Texas independence. And at this, it's particularly appropriate at this time of year when we're in the middle of we like to call in the historical profession that deals with this period of Texas history the High Holy Days. So we're between the Alamo and San Jacinto. So we're actually in the middle of the runaway scrape. And so all of that will form a part of my talk today. And at this time of year, normally the names we hear are Travis and Bowie and Crockett and Houston and Austin. But I'd like to talk about men such as Navarro and Ruiz and Beramendi and Musquiz and Seguin. These and other prominent members of the Tejano community were critically important to the creation of the Republic, even if they haven't gotten the recognition for it that I think anyway, that they merit. First, some definitions so that you know what I'm talking about, and hopefully if you have any questions on this aspect of it, we can talk about that later as well. Tejano is simply a term that historians have been using for about 35 years now to refer to Texans whose ethnic and cultural heritage are linked to the country we now call Mexico. It is, in essence, the equivalent of Texan in Spanish. So if anybody who's from Texas goes to Mexico, they are automatically a Tejano. And it doesn't matter whether they're Afro-Texan or Anglo-Texan or Mexican-American Texan or even Asian Texan. If you go to Mexico and you say you're from Texas, you're a Tejano. So it's a word that has been appropriated for use in the scholarly field to refer to people of that Mexican Spanish heritage who lived in Texas at the time. And what you see here are terms that are used in archaeological, anthropological, sociological, and historical studies to talk about where people are from, and if you're being identified by place, by ethnicity, by whether you refer to yourself as something or somebody is referring to you as that. And then I just throw in there the fact that we have Tejano has been used for an even longer period of time with regard to music. It's a particular brand of Mexican-American music particular to Texas, and for a long time it's been known as Tejano music. So as you can see here in this overly elaborate chart, what I want to emphasize is that we've got a population in Texas in the early 1830s that dates back in many families for over a century. And these are the people we've come to call Tejanos. We must also define, we must also define what we mean by Texas. For the Texas of 1835 was not what the Lone Star State is today. Texas on the eve of the War of Independence included only the area from north and east of the Medina and Nueces rivers, just south of San Antonio, all the way to the Sabine River. This is Stephen F. Austin's map that he drew in 1821, 1822 to show what was Texas. And if you'll notice in the lower, and I hope there's the cursor. This is the Rio Grande. And notice that the Nuevo Santander, what we call Tamaulipas today, stretched all the way up to the Nueces River. So that was not part of Texas. And the people who lived down there certainly didn't think of themselves as Texas. If you go further up, you can see that it says it's Coahuila. Okay, and if you go further up, then you see that it says Comanches and Lipanes or Lipan Apaches. So Texas is a portion of what is, or Texas was a portion of what is Texas today. And for Stephen F. Austin in particular, what Texas meant for him and for many of the Anglos is this, is this area over here. This is not water. This is Austin marking the river bottoms of the major rivers of Texas. Why was he marking these river bottoms? Because these river bottoms were prime cotton land. All right. So we've got Louisiana on the east and to the north. We've got Indians to the west, and we have other Mexican states to the south. And this Texas is the Texas I will be speaking about the rest of this talk. In other words, a Texas that existed before what became Texas in 1848 after the Mexican War established the boundaries of modern Texas. Because up until then, it was an open question of just how big Texas was going to be. Certainly, in the War of Independence, the Texas Republic claimed the Rio Grande as its boundary, but they weren't able to occupy or defend that boundary. It wasn't until the United States came in and bested Mexico in the Mexican War that became the boundary. So what this means is that the history of Texas in the 1820s and the 1830s has a direct relevance to the shape that the United States ultimately took. And also it has a direct relevance to the presence of indigenous Hispanic population in the region. And so whether we're talking about the people who were Tejanos before 1836 in the area that I just showed you on the Austin map, or the people who became Tejanos after 1848 when Texas absorbed the Hispanic populations of the lower Rio Grande Valley and the El Paso area, think of the importance then of the Mexican War of the period between 1836 and 1848 for refashioning what the entire southwestern United States was like. And in this story, the role of Tejanos has largely been marginalized, although it's certainly central to the turn of events. There may not have been many Tejanos, but small numbers do not necessarily mean a small influence. Tejanos were instrumental in shaping Texas history, but as the decreasing proportion of the population throughout the 19th century, as waves of immigration came in from the United States, as Europeans began to arrive, the Germans, the Czech, the Poles, even Italians, all of these people of European background were reshaping Texas. And so the proportion of the population that was of Mexican heritage shrank throughout the period. It wasn't until really the beginning of the 20th century that it began to expand, for reasons that we don't have time to get into today. Perhaps some other time, if I did a good job tonight and you like me, you can invite me back for a visit and we can talk about those things. But certainly, that decreasing proportion of the population didn't mean that they had not played a crucial role in the formation of Texas. So let me explain what I'm talking about. In 1821, there were about 3,000 Tejanos, and only a handful of the people that I'm going to call Texians for the rest of this talk. So Texians are people from the United States, mostly, who are coming to Texas, who are English-speaking, usually Protestant, and whose economic philosophy is built around cotton agriculture, because many of them come from the lower South. So those are going to be the Texians. And there's the Tejanos are going to be the Mexican Texans. All right, so those are the two groups we're talking about here. And part of the problem is that although there were about 3,000 Tejanos in 1821, there had been almost twice as many in 1800 at the onset of the Mexican War of Independence, which reached Texas twice and devastated the province. Tejanos who sided with the insurgents were killed or fled to Louisiana or to Indian-controlled areas. And among these were people like Juan Martín Beramendi, who would go on to serve as an interim governor of Coahuila in Texas in 1832, 1833, until he died in the cholera epidemic sweeping the southern United States and Mexico, and whose daughter, Ursula Beramendi, married Jim Bowie. Erasmo Seguin is another one. He was accused of treason during the Mexican War of Independence. He lost all his property, was forced to run a 6-year appeal of a conviction for treason until he was finally cleared, and only reestablished his fortunes at independence. And yet he is the man who the governor of Texas sends to Louisiana to bring Stephen F. Austin to settle in Texas. So he establishes very early relations with the Anglo-Americans, particularly with Stephen F. Austin. And so Texas in 1821 is a very, very devastated province. San Antonio has lost about half its population. Nacogdoches is almost entirely deserted and is in Spanish control along the frontier and along the Indian portions of Texas has almost completely disappeared. La Bahia has lost, or what is today Goliad, has lost a significant population as well. Most of Texas then remained in the hands of native peoples, such as Apaches and Comanches, who did not recognize Spanish, Mexican, or American sovereignty. So what the American settlers coming in are going to face is, on the one hand, essentially large tracts of open land, not occupied by anybody, but subject to the control of Indian peoples who treat that territory as their hunting grounds, and who are going to be very defensive, and who are going to lead to the Indian Wars of the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. Caught in the middle of that are going to be the Tejanos. Under the circumstances of the times, Tejanos faced a number of problems. First, they faced that chronic Indian warfare without adequate military support from the national government, a situation that they certainly felt, and justifiably so, that went back to the 18th century, and which prevented the safe movement, even in the immediate, of areas surrounding communities. It wasn't unheard of for people to go missing, or herders and field hands to turn up dead after an overnight Indian raid. So life was very sketchy at the time. Second, they faced economic disaster. The Spanish government had been unable to pay the garrisons at San Antonio and La Bahia with any regularity, so that soldiers and their families were destitute, with obvious consequences for the merchants and the farmers and the artisans who depended on the military payrolls for their business and the soldier services for protection. Third, without safe conditions or economic activity beyond the subsistence level, there was very little chance of population growth. And who would want to come to Texas, right? Under those circumstances. And particularly, what people of means, what great hacienda owners or other men who had money, who would be interested in coming to Texas and investing in Texas under those conditions, all right? It certainly wasn't attractive for a Mexican population that was just trying to recover from a 10-year-long war of independence. So newly independent Mexico appeared very ill-equipped to meet the needs of a far-off and unproductive Texas. Mexico had lost over 1 million people to the War of Independence. About 75% of the mining economy had disappeared as a result of the deliberate destruction and flooding and collapse of mines from inattention and from the unavailability of labor and sabotage. And similarly, agricultural land went barren for lack of field hands. The tax system relied almost exclusively on import and export tariffs. An inadequate funding situation, even if corruption and waste were not rampant, and a healthy chunk of available funds were not being spent on a bloated military that was left over from the War of Independence. Although Texas representatives to the national congresses between 1822 and 1824 were happy by the political autonomy and the new social compact that independence had produced, they were sobered by the knowledge that the national government could do little on its own to improve the lot of Texas and Tejanos. So Texas's first representative to Mexico City, who was a San Antonio native and the parish priest, Refugio de la Garza, had written home that divisions among Mexicans based on race or status had ended. But in economic terms, the most he could get for his province was minimal. The national government just agreed to finish the secularization of the mission so that land could be turned over to productive farmers. But in terms of any real assistance to Texas, it wasn't coming anytime soon. Texas's representative to the Second Constitutional Congress, Erasmo Seguin, Juan Seguin's father, struggled to find a place for Texas in the emerging federal union. Texas did not have a large enough population to be a state on its own. So in the spring of 1824, Seguin managed to reach an alliance with Coahuila, Texas's poor neighbor to the south, in order to avoid becoming a federal territory, which would have been an even worse fate. At least the union with Coahuila promised greater local autonomy for Texas. It was the least bad of the various scenarios that confronted Seguin, but it would prove to be an unworkable marriage. In the meantime, Tejanos sought solutions to Texas's ills elsewhere, and you might by now be figuring out where the solutions to a lot of these problems might be coming from. In stepped the Americans. Already on the eve of Mexican independence, Moses Austin had come to San Antonio to ask for permission to establish a colony of Roman Catholic Americans for whom he would serve as their land agent, otherwise known as impresario. And he was going to contract with the government to attract settlers to the frontier by offering land and being compensated in land. Like his biblical namesake, however, Moses Austin was destined not to enter the promised land with his people, a task that fell to his son Stephen, who soon changed his name to Esteban to fit in. He learned Spanish very quickly, sent his brother Brown to live with the Seguin family in San Antonio so that he might learn the language and the customs of the people with whom he would be working for the rest of his life, so they thought. Stephen F. Austin also set about establishing good working relations with other Tejanos. Instrumental to the success of Austin's early colony was Jose Antonio Saucedo, a longtime public figure who was serving as the chief administrative officer for Texas in 1823-1825, when Austin was getting himself organized. It was Saucedo who kept Austin within the law and offered advice on how to establish rules for the colony. Austin later employed the services of San Antonio businessman Gaspar Flores and Miguel Arciniega, and he later worked closely with political chief Ramon Musquiz, another native of Coahuila, who was attempting to establish his economic interests in Texas. Soon other Anglo-Americans seeking opportunities in Texas joined Austin in the land speculation business. Texas was about land, and Tejanos understood that Anglo-Americans had access to the labor, the capital, and business contacts necessary to bring about development. Francisco Ruiz famously wrote that, quote, "I cannot help seeing advantages which, to my way of thinking, would result if we admitted honest, hardworking people, regardless of what country they came from, even hell itself." With few people and lots of land, the first order of business for Tejanos was to get the land settled and the Indian frontier defended. Anglo-Americans brought an uncompromising Indian attitude toward native peoples that promised to solve the long-running problem of insecurity for Hispanic communities. Tejanos did not have the resources to defeat Apaches, Comanches, and other aggressive autonomous tribes, the Anglo-Americans did. There were not enough Tejanos or migrants from the interior of Mexico to cultivate Texas commercially, but Anglo-Americans were hell-bent on exploiting international cotton demand by expanding production everywhere possible. Tejanos saw incoming cotton interests, people whom they referred to as capitalists, because they had access to financial resources unavailable to Mexicans, as exactly what Texas needed. Never mind that they brought slaves to a country that had renounced human bondage. At every turn, then, the vast majority of the Tejano leadership favored, promoted, encouraged, and defended Anglo-American immigration. At the state congress in Saltillo and later Monclova, Tejanos such as Jose Antonio Navarro defended the practice of slavery in Texas as necessary to economic development. Properly regulated under a more humane Spanish-Mexican laws, slaves in Texas could serve the interests of development. When the state legislature opted for emancipation, it was the Tejano delegates who presented Austin's plan to allow for the practice of indentured servitude. By this ruse, slave owners would manumit their slaves on paper before crossing over into Texas on condition that the freedmen paid for their freedom with 99 years of labor. For a while, it kept the doors open to Anglo-American immigration. When the law of April 6, 1830 threatened to stop almost all immigration from the U.S., Tejanos such as political chief Ramon Musquiz and Texas representatives to the legislature Rafael Antonio Manchola and Jose Maria Balmaceda raised such complaints that Balmaceda was expelled from the legislature and Manchola censured. There were some Tejanos who were actively engaged in establishing new communities and economic activities. Martín de León, the only Tejano empresario, founded the town of Victoria and, until his death in the cholera epidemic of 1832-33, attempted to establish good working relations with American and European immigrants settling in the coastal region. His son Fernando and son-in-law Plácido Benavides continued their warm relations with most Texians and identified themselves with the Tejano Federalists. Just to the south, in the Goliad area, Carlos de la Garza, a member of an old Presidio family, established one of the largest ranching communities in the region. He counted among his friends various of the Irish and Anglo families that moved into the area in the early 1830s. As my talk so far makes obvious, Texas did not lack for Hispanic leadership, and I might argue that without that leadership, Anglo-American immigration might well have gone far more slowly. In 1831-33, Tejanos were still much farther away from rebellion than the growing Texian population, which less and less had reason to conform to Mexican practices. Although they had taken an oath to be good Mexicans, Anglo settlers, in the absence of Tejano neighbors or Mexican authorities, had recreated Southern society in Texas. Beyond the Tejano zone along the San Antonio and lower Guadalupe rivers, Anglo-Texas communities increasingly resembled places in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. Whites ran their affairs in English, and blacks, although technically free, were treated as slaves. One inspector from the national government wrote that Anglo-Americans all carried a copy of the Constitution of the U.S. in their back pockets, as if it were the law of the land. Outside of Texas, the situation inspired little confidence for the political stability and progress of the country. The hostility between the two main ideological factions of the country of Mexico, centralists who wanted a strong national government and weak state governments, and federalists who supported state autonomy, a reduction in the power of the Catholic Church, and the role of the military in public affairs, contributed to coups, rebellions, and general instability. The problem was no better at the state level, where Texas's interests appeared to take a backseat to the squabbles between the more powerful factions centered in Saltillo and Monclova. Texians saw the legislature as corrupt in making special deals with American land speculators and in ignoring what they saw what they saw as the deal that had been made to allow slave labor to operate in Texas. As the political situation in Mexico deteriorated in 1834-35, Tejanos faced increasingly difficult choices. Juan Seguin, who had assumed the office of political chief in January 1834, had to announce the news that Stephen Austin had been arrested and taken to Mexico City under charges of sedition. Austin had traveled to the nation's capital to work for the separation of Texas from Coahuila and to get the national government to free up immigration into Texas. Frustrated with the lack of progress in negotiating separate statehood for Texas, he had written a letter telling the people of Texas to start preparing for a separation, whether the national government approved or not. While Austin was in jail, Seguin attempted to call a convention in San Antonio of representatives from the municipalities of Texas to decide on a course of action. Given the fighting that had erupted between opponents and supporters of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, his reactionary takeover of the national government. In Coahuila, the anti-Santa Anna state legislature, sitting at Monclova, faced off against the pro-Santa Anna politicians in Saltillo, who called on Mexico City to support their efforts to brand the Monclova government illegal. For Tejanos, these disputes required taking sides, and Seguin saw Texas as naturally in the anti-Santa Anna, pro-states' rights federalist camp. A large number of Texians wanted no part of that struggle, however. Increasingly, they had come to see Mexican politics as mired in personality disputes, corruption, and superstition, as they like to call the Catholic Church, and their increasingly violent run-ins with Mexican officials convinced them that a military dictatorship was in the works. Their fears seemed confirmed when a large body of troops under the command of General Martín Perfecto Cos arrived and started making demands for the arrest of Texans on charges of disloyalty, and when he sent troops to Gonzales to retrieve a small cannon previously loaned to the community for Indian defense, all hell broke loose. The confrontation between Mexican troops and the local militia of Gonzales is generally treated as the first battle of the Texas Revolution. However, it's interesting to note that fighting had actually broken out earlier along the coast when Texian merchants had resisted a Mexican customs ship from confiscating a merchant vessel. So hostilities by the summer of 1835 were well underway. In the fall of that year, when rebellion broke out in Texas, it may have done so in the Texian portions of the province, but Tejanos were more than ready to take part for their own reasons. Juan Seguin had raised a company of Bejareños, that is, the citizens of San Antonio, to defend Texas against government aggression, and had participated in an abortive effort to rescue the state's Federalist governor from the Centralists earlier in the year. Plácido Benavides did the same in Goliad. For the Tejanos, rebellion was a legitimate tool of resistance to the usurpation of power by Santa Anna and his Centralist allies. They viewed the Texas revolt as one more round of struggle against despotism. Only in the spring of 1836, when the rebellion against Santa Anna's rule turned into a war for independence, the Tejanos have a new choice to make: assume responsibility for their portion of the fight or remain loyal to Mexico, even if under increasingly despotic government. Most chose the path of independence. Juan Seguin and his men fought during the runaway scrape and at San Jacinto. José Antonio Navarro and Francisco Ruiz signed the Texas Declaration of Independence, along with the Mexican nationalist Lorenzo de Zavala. The disaffected Zavala is a good example of how the loyalty of even those Mexicans who had helped fight for and secure independence and had then organized the country under a federal system was stretched beyond the breaking point. Zavala had not only helped write the Constitution of 1824, he had served as governor of the state of Mexico and as the ambassador to France. He was an admirer of the American political system and had become a bitter enemy of Santa Anna. Although he was not a Tejano, and although he had arrived in Texas only in 1835, he cast his lot with the revolution that he believed would bring a more rational and free political order into existence in Texas. Not all Tejanos sided with the cause of independence, however. Carlos de la Garza organized a company of men loyal to Mexico and assisted General Urrea in his coastal campaign. Nevertheless, Garza was unwilling to see his Texian friends persecuted and lent aid to a number of them. Perhaps because of this, he was unmolested in his property following the war and lived to establish a sizable progeny in the Goliad area. Plácido Benavides, unwilling to cross the line between rebellion against bad government and rejection of Mexico, went home to sit out the rest of the struggle when he found out about the Declaration of Independence. So you can see that different Tejanos are making different decisions about what they are going to do, how they are going to handle this situation, of which they have largely lost control. In the aftermath of the war, the fate of Tejanos was a mixed bag. The De Leon clan, which had sacrificed much on behalf of rebellion, found itself exiled to Louisiana, and their slow return to the Victoria area in the 1840s was marked by forced sales of land to cover property taxes and suspicions of disloyalty. Juan Seguin, who enjoyed initial success as a senator to the Republic Congress and as mayor of San Antonio, equally suffered a fall from grace following accusations of collaboration with Mexico, which remained unwilling to accept Texas independence. José Antonio Navarro, on the other hand, continued to hold public office as late as the Annexation Convention in the summer of 1845, and one of his sons in the 1850s served in the state legislature. Navarro helped to defend the status of Tejanos as citizens in the new Constitution and beyond. And then there is Antonio Menchaca, who served under Seguin at San Jacinto, participated in the Indian campaigns that followed, and helped defend San Antonio against the invasion of General Adrian Wall in 1842. His career as a public figure in San Antonio and as a founding member of the Texas Veterans Association cemented his status as a, quote, loyal Mexican. Nevertheless, in the long run, the problem for Tejanos was that their few numbers, their mixed racial background, their Catholic heritage, their Mexican culture, and their Spanish language combined to isolate them within a society dominated by Euro-American, Protestant, English speakers. Because of their Mexican cultural heritage, most Tejanos were looked upon as Mexicans, and Mexicans were mixed-blooded foreigners and enemies. Men such as José Antonio Navarro, Juan Seguin, and Antonio Menchaca, who could bank on their European ancestry, made a lasting impression on their fellow Texans. The names of a county and a couple of towns attest to their status. But overall, there was little interest on the part of an increasingly Anglo-American population to remember the significant role that Tejanos had played in fostering immigration and protecting the rights of Americans in Texas. It is left to us today to recover that memory and to make sure that all Texans today and tomorrow appreciate the roles of their Tejano forebears in bringing modern Texas into existence. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So like I mentioned earlier, anyone who has any questions about the presentation, about Tejanos in general, feel free to use the chat or to the left-hand side of your screen or the Q&A section. You can type in, just say me, and I can unmute you so you can ask your question, or you can go ahead and type in your full question and we will get them answered. So any Texas history questions you had or have about this presentation or what have you, go ahead and type them in and let me know. And we will share those. So while I was listening, I actually had a couple. I know that you talked about Texas looking to establish their own statehood with Mexico. Can you get into why they were denied at all? Or were they just afraid that this may end up being the cause if they had their own statehood eventually? Or
Well, the problem was one of population. Just as in the United States, you needed to, in order to form a state, you needed a certain population threshold. Before
okay,
that, you were a territory. And so everything that was in the Louisiana Purchase, for instance, was part of one great big Louisiana territory, and then states, Missouri and Arkansas, Nebraska, Kansas, all of those, Colorado, those are all formed as the population in those regions increase, and they are able to support a state government. Well, the problem with Texas is that even with the immigration that was coming from the United States, there weren't enough people for the federal government to authorize a separate state. That's why Texas had originally been joined to Coahuila, because it was a much larger population. There were 40 to 50,000 people living in Coahuila, and you were adding about 5,000 or 6,000 from Texas. All right. So by 1835, you still only got about 20, if you don't include the slave population, you've only got about 25,000 Texans or so. So it's still a relatively small population. The problem is, of course, the Texans feel themselves very different from the Coahuilans, and they think that Coahuila is keeping the development of Texas under its thumb. In other words, they are politically subservient to the Coahuila part of the state. And so they want separate statehood so they can start making decisions about what direction Texas is going to take on its own. The federal government doesn't really want that because they're increasingly scared that the decisions that these Texans are going to take are going to drive them farther and farther away from Mexico. So to use an old saw, they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. And in this case, they were damned because they didn't.
okay. Well, that answers a lot. So they had legitimate reasons for denying, but also they were worried. So,
But also they were worried. That's why they passed the law of April 6, 1830 to bring immigration under control. Stephen F. Austin managed to gain an exception from that, so he continued to bring in settlers because he had fulfilled the terms of his contract. But all the other impresario contracts that had not been fulfilled were canceled by the federal government, and they prohibited the introduction of slaves under any circumstance. So they saw the incoming Anglo-American population by 1830. Much of the Mexican leadership is seeing the incoming population as a threat to the continued, let's say, the continued participation of Texas as part of the Mexican nation.
okay.
Yeah.
Another question I have, I'm not seeing any questions from the audience just yet, but another question that you were talking about a merchant ship that was being withheld on the coast. Where was that at?
Actually, it's funny because the ship that, and I forgot the names of the ship right now, but the ship that Stephen F. Austin is returning to Texas after he's been released from jail, and he makes it to New Orleans, and then he's coming from New Orleans to Texas. They managed to pass near Matagorda Bay. They managed to witness a Mexican cutter and another American merchant ship exchanging fire. And this is in the summer of 1835. So this is what, about 3 months before Gonzales. And there had been hostilities previously. There had been the disturbance at Anahuac, so Anglo-Americans had shown a certain amount of defiance, and you can take it all the way back to 1826 in the Fredonian Rebellion. So Mexican government officials, not in Texas per se, but in Mexico City and down in Saltillo, had cause to be concerned that the separationist attitudes, that individualistic, independent streak of the Texans might cost them Texas if they didn't clamp down on things very quickly. And that's why they send a lot of troops in the fall of 1835, but all they do is precipitate the war.
Okay. Okay. We are actually getting a couple of
Yes.
questions. Our first question is from, hold on, let me get this over.
Rosa Escobar, what are some of the books you recommend for history on Texas Mexican? Okay, for Texas Mexican history, I certainly am going to recommend, obviously, one of my books, which is here somewhere, which is a collection of essays and whatnot, and it covers both the Spanish period up to 1821 and then the post-1821 period. It's called Faces of Bejar, Early San Antonio, and Texas. And what I can do, I'll just mention them right now, but what I'll do is I will send Jennifer a short bibliography that then she can distribute. So if you'll contact Jennifer, she can send that out to anybody who's interested.
I actually have everybody's email who's attending tonight,
perfect.
So I can email that bibliography to everyone. So.
Great. There's a book by Andres Tijerina, and that is somewhere around here. Anyway, Texas under the Mexican flag, Texas and Tejanos under the Mexican flag, or Tejanos and Texas under the Mexican flag, one or the other. And that is a history of Texas in the 1820s and early 1830s. There's a book by Raúl Ramos, Beyond San Antonio, which covers this period as well. I will send a list to Jennifer, and there's and I've got another book that I edited, which is a collection of essays on some of the prominent figures from that period of time. It's biographical essays on a number of individuals. So and we have a couple of we have one brand new biography, a biography of Francisco Ruiz by Art Martinez de Vara. And we also have a very good biography of Jose Antonio Navarro by David McDonald. So more and more, we're getting this period of time filled in on the history of these important Tejano figures who'd kind of been left on the margins. They'd been mentioned here and there, but really hadn't been given the consideration that they should have gotten. And let's see, we've got Joseph Bodden, who has a question. Is it reasonable to assume that Mexican soldiers that survived San Jacinto or San Jacinto, either way, and had their families with them may have stayed in the area after the battle? Okay, so that's an interesting question because people do bring up the whole notion of the soldaderas, the camp followers. The Mexican army did, as many European armies had in the 18th century. The practice kind of ended toward the end of the 18th and early 19th century, but it was still going on in Mexico in the 19th century because of conditions. There were camp followers. And so sometimes the wives, in rarer instances, children, would follow their men on campaigns. There is no evidence, however, of there being camp followers at the Mexican camp at San Jacinto. However, there is, although there's no study has actually been done because the sources are kind of sketchy, it'd be an awful lot of hard work to find out. But we do know that some Mexican soldiers remained behind and did not return to Mexico and established themselves in Texas. And as a matter of fact, later on, when the Republic will establish courts of claim, and then the state will also have courts of claim for people to make claims for land based on one thing or another, there are going to be complaints that there are Mexican soldiers who fought against the Texans who are claiming land in Texas. So we know that there are men who did remain behind. It's possible that some with their families remained behind or went back to Mexico and brought their families back, but it was a relatively small number. It wasn't large numbers of men. And of course, the bulk of the Mexican army withdrew after the defeat of Santa Anna. Santa Anna is defeated with a very small portion of the overall number of troops that the Mexicans have in Texas. There's an army of about 5,000 men under Urrea. There's about 3,500 to 4,000 men under Filisola. Santa Anna gives the order for them to withdraw beyond the Rio Grande, and they do. We don't. And then after that, part of those armies disperses. Some of those people remain in the area. So there's still research that can be done, and there are sources. It's just tough to find that information because you almost have to look individual by individual. So it's tough to the army records aren't specific enough to give you a complete answer.
We do have another question from Michael. What benefit was Texas to Mexico that caused Mexico to want to hang on to them? Was it cotton, produce, a buffer zone?
Well, the buffer zone, Texas had been a buffer zone in the 18th century. Texas is established, it's settled. The missionaries came to save souls, but essentially the government was paying them to essentially create a buffer zone between the French to the east in Louisiana and the autonomous but very warlike Indian peoples of the interior and the more settled, more developed parts of the interior of Mexico. So the role of Texas in the 18th century was to act as a buffer zone, as a frontier. Essentially, in fact, it's referred to, one famous quote, it's referred to as the rampart of Spanish America, because that's where we're going to hold off the invaders, whether they're rival Europeans and later Americans or they're Indians. But in the 19th century, obviously, when Mexico becomes independent, it claims to be the successor state to Spain. So it claims all the territory that Spain had claimed. So that's why California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, part of Colorado, all that region, New Mexico, all that region is all, technically speaking, from a Mexican perspective, part of the Mexico that was inherited at independence from Spain. So obviously, it would be like saying that at the end of the War of 1812, because the English at the Treaty of Ghent proved that they had been successful in their campaigns of the United States, was going to keep the Ohio Valley. In fact, there were British troops occupying various forts at the end of the war in the Ohio Valley. So the United States might have lost that territory. How would the United States have felt? It might have led to another war or the continuing of war with Britain. Well, Britain withdrew. The United States got to keep all its territory. So although it wasn't very well settled. So my point is that it was territory that Mexico considered part of the Mexican nation. And if for no other reason than for pride, it wasn't about to let somebody take it from them. But of course, Texas had a lot of potential. And although the Mexican government, the Mexican nation, the Mexican economy was not in a position to take advantage of developing Texas right now, it didn't mean they wouldn't want to develop it in the future. It was kind of the argument that was made about, why are we acquiring Alaska? What are we going to do with Alaska? It's, and of course, Seward's Folly turns out to be a cash cow later on, right? It does have a lot to offer. But imagine if we had turned down purchasing Alaska. Well, for Mexico, the fact that they can't develop Texas right now doesn't mean that they don't want to hold on to it. Of course they do. And at first they invited Americans because they thought Americans could help develop a part of Mexico that Mexico itself couldn't. And by the way, it isn't the only place where people from the United States wound up settling in Mexico. You have large numbers of Mennonites in northwestern Mexico. In fact, one of the recent Mexican presidents, Fox, is descended from Americans who went to live in Mexico. So there was a tradition of people crossing the border in a southerly direction. The question was, are you going to continue to operate as part of Mexico, or are you going to break away? And for the Texans, the answer was, life is unbearable under the Mexican government as it is. It's just better to break away.
Unfortunately, I don't have,
Yep.
because I handed over host to you. I can't unmute people right now. But if you have any other questions, again, you can ask them in the Q&A section or the chat on the right-hand side. I'm sorry, it said earlier left. He said thank you very much for that answer.
Okay.
Let's see. And I think that's about it. I have one other. So you were talking about earlier that the Tejano population had a mixed racial background.
Uh-huh.
So you're talking the European and the Native American?
And African.
And African, okay.
And African. There was the slave trade to Mexico peters out about the middle of the 17th century. But by then, hundreds of thousands, couple of 100,000 Africans had been brought, mostly between the period of about 1580 to 1640. There was a large importation of enslaved African people into Mexico. They mix with the Indian population, and they mix with the Spanish population, and they mix with the mixed population. So by the early 19th century, Mexico is a very racially mixed society in which Europeans are still are the dominant group. They are a minority, but Spaniards and the descendants of Spaniards are still at the top. But for instance, Mexico's second president, Vicente Guerrero, was himself an Afro-Mexican. He had African blood, and he was the president. So the problem with understanding things in racial terms is that although Mexico was a racialized society, it means that race played an important role in society. It's different from the type of racialized society that we have in the United States. It expresses itself differently. And so that would be another long talk by me on another evening. But it's a very good question. And I think people always forget the African element in that equation. They always just think Europeans and Indians, but it was European, Indians, and Africans.
Okay, very interesting. So I'm not seeing any other questions. If you have one, let me double check. Hold on, I'm having a hard time with my cursor. Okay. All right, I think that's all we have.
All right.
So I want to thank you again for joining us. I definitely want to talk to you about maybe a future talk. I really enjoyed your speech tonight, and I'm sure everybody else enjoyed the presentation as well. So thank you again for being with us this evening, and thank all of you for joining us in the audience.
Well, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your evening and spring break, and hopefully we'll all be able to see each other live in the not too distant future.